Thank you very much for being here today, and I want to thank our three witnesses. We have two that are here in person and one by video conference. So by video conference, we have Abid Shamdeen, who is co-executive director and co-founder of Nadia's Initiative, which is an organization dedicated to advocating for victims of sexual violence and rebuilding communities in crisis. We also have with us Susan Cora, who is a representative of A Demand for Action, a global initiative that advocates for protection of Assyrian, Chaldean, Syriac Christians and other minorities in the Middle East. And we also have Matthew Travis Barber here in person, the executive director of Yazda, a multinational Yazidi organization that was established to support Yazidi and other vulnerable groups. Former executive, sorry, I stand corrected. Today we will be hearing on the topic of an update on the human rights situation of the Yazidis, Christians, and other religious and ethnic minorities in Iraq. And I would like to begin with with Abid, because you are on video conference, and just in case we have technical difficulties, we'd like to start with you. And you'll each have 10 minutes, and then we'll do one round of questions, 7 minutes each, and then some little bit of committee business at the end of the meeting. So go ahead, Mr. Shamdeen.
Hello. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to be with you today and speak to you via video conference. And I'm sorry I was not able to attend in person because we have been very busy recently with the work we do for Yazidis and other minorities in Iraq. I just want to begin by reminding us about the situation and how we got here with the Yazidis. I know you are familiar with the situation, but I just want to remind in terms of numbers and back from 2014 until now. When ISIS attacked Yazidis, it was, in my opinion, was a planned attack, systematic attack against Yazidis to eradicate Yazidis basically from Iraq. The numbers were close to 500,000 Yazidis or 400,000 Yazidis in Sinjar, in the ancestral homeland of Yazidis. When ISIS attacked, they killed about close to 5,000 Yazidis in August of 2014. They enslaved about 6,500 Yazidi women and children. Most of the Yazidis that were killed were elderly women that ISIS did not want to take for slavery. The Yazidi women and children, the children ended up being brainwashed. A lot of them were recruited for ISIS to fight with ISIS. Some of them are currently fighting with ISIS in Syria. Out of these numbers, about 3,000 Yazidis remain in captivity, mostly children. The rest are women that have been in captivity since 2014. About 350,000 Yazidis remain displaced in IDP camps in northern Iraq in the region of Kurdistan. Few thousand Yazidis are in refugee camps in both Turkey and Greece. I believe we have so far discovered about 67 mass graves that contain the remains of Yazidis. One was discovered just 2 days ago in the town of Tel Azir, south of Sinjar. Yes, about 67 mass graves. As the areas are getting liberated, as Iraq was liberated from ISIS, Yazidi areas were historically neglected by the governments, both the KRG and the Iraqi government. But past 2003, the Yazidi areas were mainly under KRG, controlled by the Kurdistan government. But after this genocide by ISIS, Yazidi areas continue to be neglected, and as Mosul and other areas have been liberated. All eyes have been on Mosul. Most of the support have been shifted to Mosul. Most of the IDPs have returned home um, uh, from Mosul, Tikrit, and other areas. Yet Yazidis remain in the IDP camps. This because of the political competition mainly, and the unwilling of both the KRG and the Iraqi government not to rebuild the Yazidi areas, not to provide security for Yazidis. But part of this reason is because Yazidis were never involved in their own security, in their own local governance. And this is what led to the genocide. But after the genocide, this continued to be an issue for Yazidis. So today, as Iraq is liberated and people have returned home, Yazidis are forced, in my opinion, I feel like Yazidis are held captive in these IDP camps because first, their areas are not rebuilt, there is no security, the access has been blocked to Sinjar. So the roads that lead to Sinjar from Kurdistan, from the IDP camps, have been blocked since 2014 on and off. But since 2016 or 17, these roads have been completely blocked. I have been in talks with both KRG and the Iraqi government. They both blame the closure of these roads on each other. We still don't get clear answers from either side as why these roads are blocked, but we believe mainly because it's the issue of control. As you know, these areas are disputed, and each side wants to control the area, and they do not want Yazidis to be back in their homes unless either side has full control of this of Sinjar. What we think is that the involvement of, for example, Canada and other Western governments simply does not help by just providing some sort of financial support to UN programs. Even when you fund these programs, it does not end up getting to Sinjar and other areas that are disputed. So what we did is we have tried to initiate a separate program. It's called Nadia's Action Fund. We have been in talks with mainly the French government. I am not sure. I was trying to get material printed for you. President Macron, who we met recently at the Paris Peace Forum, pledged to support this initiative financially, and he personally launched the fund for us. Part of this is because we want to make sure that Yazidis are part of the solution by empowering the community. If Yazidis are not part of the governance of their own areas and the reconstruction and the security, it simply is not going to work. Having someone come from Kurdistan or Baghdad or Basra to run Yazidi areas for them. So I think the problem is we have failed and continue to fail to involve Yazidis and even Christians in governing their own areas and managing their security. We met also with Mr. Trudeau at the Peace Forum, and we have urged him to also take action and help with some of these issues. I know Canada has taken some Yazidis in, as mainly survivors, and I've raised this issue last time when I participated in the Citizenship Committee. We believe that since Canada took these families, they should continue to relocate the rest of the family members that remain in Iraq. The Yazidi community, as I mentioned in the beginning, the very fabric of this community was shattered, and families have been separated. Almost each Yazidi family has either lost some members of their family or have family members in refugee camps, IDP camps somewhere. So it's very important that to reunite some of these families after relocating some of the survivors. I'm trying to keep track of the time, so if I run over time, please let me know. So I'm very glad that Matthew Barber is also with us. He's very informed on the issues with Yazidis. He and I worked together in Iraq to help Yazidi community in Sinjar. I believe that the responsibility of some of the Western governments is not, like I said, simply by contributing some funds to the UN. We need to take action further. You need to put pressure on both KRG and the Iraqi government to lift blockade on Yazidi areas and to involve Yazidis in the local governance of their own areas and to make sure that Yazidis are able, like everybody else, to return to their own homes and help them recover from this genocide. We have worked with the UK government and the US government, as you know, to pass the UN resolution to investigate ISIS crimes. This resolution was passed in September of last year. I have been speaking with the head of the team, Mr. Karim Khan of the UN. So far, the UN has not created a structure or this team to go and collect the evidence of these mass graves, of the genocide that was committed against Yazidis.
If you could wind up just a little bit, because you're at your time.
Okay. So I hope I will get time to clarify some of these things during the Q&A, but I feel like Canada, just like France, should get involved directly, not through the UN only. I think it's very important to empower UN institutions, but also it's important to get involved directly and empower these communities that face genocide and help them run their areas by themselves.
Okay, thank you very, very much. We'll now go to Matthew Barber, our second witness, for 10 minutes.
Thank you so much. 8 minutes to tell you everything wrong with Iraqi minorities and a solution to fix the problem. I'll try to move as fast as I can. Over the past 3.5 years since the Yazidi genocide began, I have been repeatedly asked to give lectures, presentations, and briefings, such as this one, to members of parliaments and congresses and to numerous government agencies on the status of Sinjar and on the question of how we can help the Yazidis and other minorities in Iraq. But the advice that I and other advocates have consistently given to the officials of Western governments has never been followed. That advice is to get involved directly in the internal political morass in Iraq that by definition is the cause of the abuse, the discrimination, and the systematic disenfranchisement that afflicts Iraqi minorities and places their very future existence in their homelands at risk. Now, operatives of the Islamic State organization, which I will call IS, still exist in Iraq, and even if its organizational structure and ruling capabilities have been broken, the extremist ideology of religious intolerance continues to thrive within many segments of the society, and this will remain a perennial problem for religious minorities. But while IS is certainly the most brazenly depraved actor in the region, IS is not the player that most jeopardizes the future of minorities in Iraq. The actors that are most responsible for endangering the survival and continuity of religious minorities in Iraq are not Islamist extremists, but so-called legitimate political entities jostling for territory and power. This competition centers around the problem of the disputed territories, which include areas high in minority populations such as Sinjar and Nineveh, that became contested between the central government in Baghdad and the Kurdish regional government in the north after Saddam Hussein's regime fell in 2003. In Sinjar, from the fall of Saddam to the Yazidi genocide in 2014, Baghdad was responsible for the budget for Sinjar's infrastructure and services, but Sinjar was controlled by Kurdish armed forces and security. These Peshmerga forces are not a national Kurdish military, but partisan militias controlled by specific political parties. Sinjar fell under the control of the forces loyal to the Kurdistan Democratic Party, or KDP, the ruling party of former President Masoud Barzani. This party did not allow the central government to play a role in Sinjar's administration. Instead, the KDP unilaterally appointed most of Sinjar's administrative officials without elections or any say on the part of the local Yazidi population. Further, the KDP began to use repressive techniques against political rivals in Sinjar, intimidating and jailing Yazidis who joined political parties that favored local governance and direct engagement with Baghdad, rather than the annexation of Sinjar to the Kurdistan region. Now, this is all prior to the genocide. Nevertheless, some Yazidis in Sinjar hoped that Kurdish rule might advance the status of the marginalized Yazidi minority, but these hopes were irreversibly shattered on the day that the Yazidi genocide began. This was one of the most egregious instances of disregard for an ethno-religious minority in our era. As the IS jihadists approached Sinjar, the Peshmerga forces affiliated with the KDP, who were responsible for Sinjar's security, were ordered by the Kurdish authorities in Erbil to withdraw. These forces never engaged the enemy, but withdrew prior to the arrival of the jihadists. Instead of facilitating an evacuation and providing cover to civilians, the Peshmerga fled even before the Yazidi families could leave, and refused to leave weapons behind even when the Yazidis begged them for weapons to defend their families. And we all know the result. Over 6,000 Yazidis enslaved, over half of whom were female, as many as 10,000 Yazidis killed. Following the genocide, the overwhelming majority of Yazidis from Sinjar have understandably rejected Kurdish claims to Sinjar's administration. Since August 2014, Yazidis have consistently demanded that Baghdad work directly with their community to develop local, nonpartisan administrative and security institutions so that Yazidis can govern their own affairs within the framework of a united Iraq, just like Abid just told us via teleconference. The Yazidis and advocates like myself have also repeatedly begged the international community and Western governments to facilitate this process by working directly with Baghdad, to support the process and hold them accountable. The survival of the Yazidi minority in their homeland depends on making Sinjar safe and stable. But instead of pursuing this form of action, countless world leaders have done photo ops with Nadia Murad, have made overtures about the rights of Yazidis, and in some cases have designated certain funds for humanitarian relief. But over 4 years after the genocide, Sinjar is neither safe nor stable. Instead, the Kurdistan Democratic Party has targeted Yazidis with increasing levels of abuse and political violence. Angry that the PKK-affiliated forces that defended Sinjar from the jihadists later established a permanent presence that has resisted KDP attempts to reassume control over this disputed territory. The KDP implemented an economic blockade that prevented the Yazidis who survived the genocide from transporting foodstuffs, household goods, school supplies, farm equipment, and reconstruction materials needed to rebuild their own destroyed homes. In effect, the Iraqi Kurdish powers have deliberately prevented the reconstruction of Sinjar and have prevented displaced Yazidis, who have been living in tents for over 4 years, from returning home and continuing their lives. Human Rights Watch reported on this blockade, but almost 3 years since it was first implemented, the road from the Dahuk region to Sinjar remains completely closed. KDP security forces have arrested, beaten, and intimidated Yazidis who have joined or attempted to join PKK-affiliated militias in order to defend their homeland. They have also expelled the destitute civilian families of young Yazidi men who joined non-Peshmerga Iraqi militias to help liberate Yazidi villages from IS jihadists. The KDP has at times prevented medicine from reaching Sinjar, I saw this personally, and has prevented NGOs from conducting humanitarian and reconstruction work in Sinjar. Most recently, KDP security forces have threatened scores of displaced Yazidis living in camps in the Kurdistan region with expulsion from the camps if they vote for independent Yazidi candidates running in Iraqi parliamentary elections, i.e. Yazidis not affiliated with the KDP ticket. So the answer to the question of the status of Iraqi minorities post-IS, therefore, is that local political competitors continue to abuse them and many of their homelands remain unlivable. The situation of the Assyrian Christians is similar to that of the Yazidis in that the KDP authorities use a number of manipulative and coercive tactics to impose unilateral control over the Nineveh plain against the wishes of the majority of Assyrians who, like the Yazidis, would prefer to develop forms of local governance and security within the framework of a united Iraq rather than see their homelands annexed to a Kurdistan region whose leaders have sworn to pursue an end goal of secession from Iraq. Unfortunately, Western officials rarely hear the real voices of these minorities because of the clever strategy of the KDP's financial patronage system. The KDP co-opts significant Yazidi and Assyrian community figures, including priests, bishops, other clergy, university professors, tribal leaders, and political elites, by placing them on the party's payroll. As soon as a tribal leader or a bishop, for example, accepts a KDP salary, they have effectively eliminated their own ability to speak out in defense of the rights of the community, To criticize KDP policy would mean the loss of the financial patronage that they have come to enjoy. In this way, the KDP has managed to eliminate almost all public opposition. When Western governmental entities, such as this committee, solicit the recommendations of visible Yazidi and Assyrian political elites in Iraq, these figures are almost always KDP affiliated and therefore deliver a message consistent with KDP ambitions rather than one that reflects the true sentiments of their constituencies. This strategy has had a tremendously destructive impact on the status of these minorities who have effectively become sheep without a shepherd. Most recently, the KDP and other political entities have exploited the minority quota system to elect their own appointees to Iraqi parliament. So there's a minority quota system in Iraq whereby Assyrians are guaranteed a certain number of seats within the system. And yet, because the law is broken, it is not restricted that only Assyrians can vote for those seats. Technically, Muslims can vote for these seats. So what happened this year was that several non-Assyrian political parties, including the KDP, influenced thousands of Muslims who have never visited Nineveh in their lives and who inhabit non-Assyrian districts on the other side of the country. We're talking about places like Basra, places like Kirkuk, to vote for co-opted Assyrian figures running on the tickets of these non-Assyrian parties like the KDP. So as of this year, despite a quota designed to guarantee that Assyrian Christians will enjoy a minimum level of political agency, the Assyrians of Iraq have virtually no government representation. And there's going to be a report on this released very soon that I recommend you read. And on political patronage, there's a report that was issued last year. I was a co-author. It's called Erasing Assyrians. It's easy to find if you Google it. That gives a lot of information about the patronage system. The new report is going to be coming from the Assyrian Policy Institute. It's going to talk about all of these election fraud tactics. So I'm pretty much done. I know that those of you sitting on this committee probably think, well, this is quite sad, but it's difficult to do anything about it, especially if your focus is immigration to Canada and not foreign affairs. But I just want to emphasize that if we really want to do something to solve the situation of Iraqi minorities, which keeps coming up, even if it seems like a remote and minor issue compared to everything else that our constituencies deal with, it keeps coming up. And if we want to fix it, it's going to involve direct political action. I propose a commission established by either one or more governments who have influence in Iraq that can work directly with Baghdad, who I think would be very receptive to this, to resolve the issue of the disputed territories and create the local governance that is needed in Sinjar. Otherwise, Kurdish parties will take over Sinjar again, and it'll be back to the status quo prior to the genocide. And most Yazidis will continue to emigrate from the country and seek refuge in the West. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barber, and we will now hear from Susan Cora.
Okay, that's going to be a tough act to follow. Anyway, Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here. Just to introduce myself quickly, I'm actually an Ottawa-based freelance journalist. I'm not of Iraqi background myself, so I can't speak from a sort of personal experience perspective. However, I'm a Syriac Orthodox Christian, major denomination in Iraq, so I have lots of sources of information through that network. And also because I'm a volunteer, have been for the past year, with an organization based in Sweden called a Demand for Action that was founded and is run by Assyrian/Chaldean/Syriac Christians who have emigrated to Sud Italia. So, and I also have some Yazidi contacts through my journalistic work. So, all right, to talk about Christians, the Christian population of Iraq, as you probably know, was estimated at 1.3 million before the fall of Saddam Hussein, but the numbers have been in free fall since then. A Catholic NGO, Aid to Christians in Need, issued a report about a year ago, and they described the forced exodus of Christians from Iraq as very severe. And this report also says there were 275,000 Christians in 2015. And in 2017, this dwindled to 150,000. So, okay. According to the American magazine National Review, over half the country's Christians are internal refugees. And this report predicts that Christianity in Iraq could be effectively wiped out within 20 years if the population continues to decline at this precipitous rate. Living in, and where are these internally displaced Christians? Living in UN-sponsored camps is not a viable option for these. Many of my informants, they've repeatedly told me that it's virtually impossible for them to go to UNHCR camp because they're attacked, intimidated, and harassed by their fellow refugees just for being who they are. And they've said it's like a nightmare living there. I'd say it's something like similar for LGBT refugees. So until recently, I want to say that the organization I represent, Demand for Action, has actually protested this in front of the UNHCR office in Beirut, Lebanon, but nothing has changed. Now, until recently, these internally displaced Christians of Iraq were living in church-run camps and makeshift shelters. A colleague, a journalist, Jordan Alott, he's also a filmmaker based in Virginia, has visited Iraq just this last September to film a documentary on persecuted Christians in different parts of the world, including Iraq. And he has reported that with diminishing financial support, the last church-run camp in Erbil in the Kurdistan region was dismantled, and these displaced Christians have really nowhere to go. So many of them are going back to their former homes in cities like Karakosh, is that the right pronunciation? Okay, which was once a thriving Christian city. But some of them are going because they have no option, but others feel very, very strongly that they've got to go back and reclaim their homeland, because to them, the plains of Nineveh and Mosul are sacred spaces. It's where they have practiced. They see themselves as a very, very distinct ethno-cultural religious group, not generic Christians who can be dispersed and continue their community and their language, Aramaic, which they feel is a very precious legacy of Christianity itself, because it's the language that Jesus himself spoke. So they fear a loss of culture and identity, and they've told me themselves, if we're scattered in diasporas all over the world, we'll be lost as a culture, and all traces of Christianity will be wiped out. ISIS has already desecrated and destroyed many churches, historical manuscripts, and made a good attempt to remove all traces of Christianity, 2 millennia of Christianity in this region. But the challenges of returning home, as both these gentlemen have said, are not that simple. The challenges can be summed up as the need for guarantees, the right to equal citizenship under the rule of law, security, and economically the ability to work and to raise a family in peace. The churches in Iraq, all denominations, have been trying to coordinate reconstruction efforts and bring some hope to Nineveh's Christians. Much of this reconstruction work is carried out through the Nineveh Reconstruction Committee, an interdenominational organization. So some of these denominations see the answer as creating a safe homeland for themselves, similar to the Kurdistan region. But there are internal arguments and dissensions. Others see that as a kind of creating a Christian ghetto, and they would rather be part of the citizenry of Iraq. Iraq's remaining Christians are appealing to Western governments, including Canada, not only to help fund the reconstruction of the Nineveh plains, but also to use their power in both Baghdad and the Kurdistan region of Iraq to guarantee the security of all minorities, Christians, Yazidis, and there are others as well. and to ensure equality of citizenship, including property rights and freedom of worship. Now, Christians are also appealing to the international community to recognize the atrocities perpetrated against them as genocide. So far, only the European Union, the US, UK, and a few countries in Europe have done this. Now, I have a little bit of information about Yazidis, just to add to what Mr. Abid and Matthew said. I have been speaking with Dalal Abdi. She's the Canadian director of SDIR, and she has a kind of wish list, which basically complements what Mr. Abid said. She's appealing. There are apparently at present less than 1,500 Yazidis in Canada, in London, Ontario, where Dalal lives, Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. And she's appealing to Canada to accept more Yazidi refugees, not only because family members are missing, but it's so critical to the healing of all the trauma that people have been through, especially women. She talked about women who just cannot be healed while they're worrying sick about mothers and sisters still being in ISIS captivity and horrible things happening to them. And she spoke about this blockade on the road from Doha to Sinjar, and she mentioned that there have been floods lately, and that's really added to the misery of the people who are all living in tents and so on. And she was asking if Canada can do anything to speed up the process of forming an investigation team so that perpetrators of these atrocities can be brought to justice. I believe this Canadian William Wiley has taken some steps in that regard to set up a team to investigate and bring these perpetrators to justice. And then her final thing on the wish list was to support the rebuilding of the infrastructure in Sinjar. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cora. We will go to 6-minute rounds just to ensure that we have enough time. 7 minutes. Okay, but try to keep it as short as you can. And we'll start with Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank our witnesses for being here with us today. And I don't think we'll be able to do a full job in 7 minutes here, but we'll try. Mr. Shamdien, I just wanted to ask you, there were women were taken and raped, and we heard of accounts of them having children and being placed in families and you know, the creation of new families with their children and that. I'm just wondering how many of them are still held, how many were trafficked to other countries, and what are the efforts that are being made right now to bring them back home?
Well, so as I mentioned, when I started, thousands were taken into captivity. Most of the ones that were rescued were mostly bought by their own family or relatives or friends. But right now, as ISIS is being pushed from Syria, a lot of the jihadists, when they want to escape from Syria and need financial support for that, they offer some of the Yazidi women for sale to their families. But they usually ask for $30,000, $25,000, which is, you know, a money that they do not have. But the problem is there was never a special task formed by the Iraqi and the Kurdish government, whom I think both were responsible for this genocide on Yazidis and failed to protect Yazidis. They did not form a task force to follow up and try to rescue these women and children. But most importantly, this coalition that was formed to fight ISIS, which I think Canada is part of, did not also follow up specifically on the issue of Yazidis held in captivity, especially in Syria.
And this was something that it impacted the Christian communities as well?
the numbers of the Christians, I'm not sure about, but I think we're a couple hundred. I followed up on that back in 2015 and 16 through the State Department, and we were able to get them some support. ISIS refused to negotiate about the Yazidi women and children because they considered Yazidis infidels and were worthy of enslavement, but they negotiated about the Christians and were able to get them released.
Okay, thank you. I was here prior to 2015 election, and I was on Foreign Affairs, and so we talked about some of these issues then. And one of the things we talked about at the time was trying to reestablish the local government structures that would need to be put in place. And from what you're saying today, that has not been successfully done. And one component of that was talking about how do we bring about justice. You talked about accountability and holding perpetrators accountable. There's a couple models. One is the world does it from outside, and the second one, and I think the preferred one in our discussions with witnesses, was that people be able to somehow establish local control and local justice issues. And I'm just wondering, has that been able to get started at all, or is these other things, the quotas, the political blockades, the military control, and is that interfering even with the capacity to do that?
It's not so much that those things are interfering with it, it's that the government neglects this entirely. So you have the Kurdish regional government, dominated by the KDP party. They have their sights set on annexing Sinjar, so they try to occupy it. The problem with Baghdad is they're just completely neglectful. Nineveh governorate and Sinjar are so remote to them compared to all the problems that they have. In principle, they claim that the disputed territory should be administered by Baghdad, but then they don't really lift a finger to do anything there.
Can I ask you a question then?
Yeah.
You mentioned the commission to work with Baghdad would be well received by them. Is it primarily because they would see it as an opportunity to extend their control to this area
Exactly.
in any useful fashion, or do they just want the territory? Are they actually concerned about good governance in this area, or will it be left basically as it was before, but they will control the territory?
I think that the commission would eliminate the headache on their part of having to figure out how to create the infrastructural development and the administrative institutions that have never really existed there. So it's not so much reestablishing administration, it's creating it for the first time. The KDP finally left. They took all the Peshmerga out at the end of fall 2017. Since that time, over a year, we've had this vacuum, this perfect opportunity to develop these institutions. And Yazidi activists have been calling for that. And they've actually been meeting with officials in Baghdad, with the Prime Minister's office frequently, asking that he would appoint a new, it's called a Kaimakam, which is the district head of Sinjar, that would then have the authority to start bringing NGOs in that could do reconstruction. The problem is right now, if I'm an NGO and I want to do reconstruction in Sinjar, I don't even have a party to go through that can authorize my work.
So why is the international community so disinterested?
Oh, that's a wonderful question.
Yeah.
I've been asking that question for several years now. I don't understand.
Mr. Shamdeen, you
It's
seem
heartbreaking, really.
It is.
But here's what I would say.
Okay, I'll rephrase that. What do we need then to get the international community re-engaged in this issue so that they will show some responsibility for the redevelopment of this
The
area?
international community wants to give money to pre-existing entities like UN agencies that have a limited capacity to do the kind of thing I'm recommending. They don't want to get involved in internal Iraqi politics because they call that state building, and then they say this is colonialism, we don't belong there. The irony is, Western governments didn't have a problem signing up with the U.S. coalition to effect regime change in Iraq, invade and occupy the country. That created the instability that led to ISIS. Now that we need to rebuild it, suddenly it's colonialism to be involved. What I'm suggesting is that a coalition go to Baghdad, propose a working relationship, not impose themselves on the country. Say, look, you've got a problem with this genocide. The whole world is looking at Iraq. Iraq has the first Nobel Peace Prize winner now who's from the Yazidi population. You need to do something about this. Let us help you. They would say, this is great. We can't really deal with Sinjar. We don't have the capacity to. Corruption is a big problem. This commission could then go to Sinjar, work with local Yazidis, create a real election, a fair election. It's never happened, to create a leadership system there. Then that would make it possible to start bringing in reconstruction groups. So Mike Pence now, he's said they're going to give a lot of money for Iraqi minorities. The problem I have with that is you don't have a system on the ground in place that can use that money responsibly Most Yazidis are still unable to get back to Sinjar. All the problems we've been talking about. Everything's cart before the horse right now. We need security administration there. It needs to be local people. It's not about creating a new Kurdistan region for the Assyrians in Nineveh or for the Yazidis. All you have to do is create a governorate in Sinjar. It'll have the same governor, just like Mosul has a governor, just like Kirkuk has a governor. Every directorate has a governor. Create that and let local people fill those offices instead of a political party with an army.
Thank you so much.
Sorry for
but we're over
my
your
long answer.
time,
Okay.
and we do have some committee business
Sure.
at the end, so we'll go to Mr. Tabara.
Thank you very much for all your testimonies. And actually, Mr. Barber, this is a kind of a good segue into, I'll let you kind of finish your statement there. You mentioned that that governments need to be held account, that actors must be responsible. In a conference in Kuwait not too long ago, they pledged $30 billion to reconstruct Iraq. But they have issues with corruption, and I think this is what you were just talking about. How can we ensure that if we are pledging this many billions of dollars, that it's going to the right areas and it's not going to just the central government, but it's actually being widespread throughout all of Iraq, and so that everyone, is rebuilding, ensuring that they are going back to their homes, there's security and safety? How do we ensure that that corruption doesn't get in the way?
Iraq's a big country, and I can't offer solutions for the whole thing. Corruption there is a tremendous problem. What I can say is that regarding these areas that are minority populated, like Sinjar and Nineveh, if you had these commissions that were, say, several representatives of a few Western governments were included in a small body that was present on the ground, monitoring the implementation of reconstruction and humanitarian work while working on the political side, simultaneous. They could be coupled together, humanitarian work, reconstruction, and administration, institution building. These groups would be on the ground watching how the money is used, supervising it, basically. I think that would be a tremendous boon. They could be interfacing with the Iraqi government, giving respect to them, making their officials feel involved, but also sort of policing it in a soft way.
I'm actually going to share my time with MP Saini.
Thank you, Mr. Barber. You raised a very interesting point, and I just wanted to build on that because I think that some of the stuff that you've said is, it's amenable to what I'm thinking. But in the geopolitical struggle that's happening in Iraq right now, that there's two types of governance structures. There's one on the ground and one internationally. Should we, and this is just a proposal, should we somehow get the geopolitical actors that have influence in Iraq but are not Iraqi to somehow come to some conclusion? So to conclude some sort of agreement, which would put pressure on their surrogates on the ground to say, look, this now has to be, because to me it seems like a fractured sort of mishmash there where different people are taking orders from different parts or different people or different entities. And yet if we can get the entities on the top say, look, this is the agreement we've come to, now please implement. And second of all, and I know this is a really quick question, one of the things Oxfam has done and some of the other human rights organizations have done when it comes to aid is rather give it through an organization or a middle person, but give it directly to the people so they would fund whatever purchases they need to fund, either through a debit card or a direct cash transfer. This way you're eliminating the middle person or the middleman and you're providing aid directly to the people rather than having it going through another organization where it could be lost to corruption.
So just really quick for the last point, when I was director of YASDA in Iraq, which was a period of 1 year, some of our staff created that very program, but specifically for Yazidi women that had been enslaved and then had survived and had been, so it wasn't the whole community, but it was something done with the Baghdad government through their Directorate of Women's Protection, Ministry of Social Affairs. It's a special card, it gives them a monthly stipend for the rest of their lives. Even if they leave the country and come back, they will continue to get it. So any woman who was enslaved qualified for that. Those kind of programs could be expanded. But I think that in general, we know what's bigger is Yazidis don't just need continual handouts. We can rebuild the Yazidi economy. We did this by taking chickens and sheep and other things to Sinjar for families that have returned. They will start to survive and rebuild their homes. What we should focus on is reconstruction, not like these cash handouts for indefinitely. We can help them build their lives again. For the geopolitical question, so here's the problem. It is a fractured country. Many players. Turkey has 20 military bases inside the Kurdistan region in northern Iraq right now. The KDP is a proxy of Turkey. The other side of the KRG alone, the PUK in Sulaymaniyah, they're basically an ally of Iran. Iran also has influence in Baghdad. A lot of the small proxy militias that are active in these disputed territories, they're loyal to one of those different sides. So the alignments get very complex. I've written diagrams and mappings of that in the past. The U.S.'s relationship with Turkey is very poor right now. The relationship with Iran doesn't exist, and our president has made sure that it gets worse. That just seems like a no-go area right now. I don't think we can create stability in Iraq by asking other regional partners to change their approach. Those regional partners are themselves competitors with each other. I think what we should do is exploit the relationships that our governments, Canadian, U.S., European governments, have with Baghdad and the Kurdistan region to promote our own policy. The policy being saving these minorities. I'm not talking about a major geopolitical strategy that has to do with interests for our countries that would look like neo-imperialism or colonialism. I'm talking just about the need to help this tapestry of diversity survive in Iraq. So when it comes to making sure Yazidis can stay in their homeland instead of continuing to migrate to Germany and Canada and elsewhere, we can work directly with those partners and push that agenda, which is our agenda.
All right, thank you. We'll move on to Ms. Hardcastle for 7 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for your comments. And this is a really intriguing discussion, and I'm still trying to get my head around this idea that we need to be supporting local governments and not using the international community. And I'm not fleshing it out just with time, but you know what I think we need to be using more of our international structures, especially in order to bring people to criminal court, because what I see as the biggest problem that isn't talked about enough in all of this, in the power struggle and the geopolitical relationships, is this horrendous and brute concept of power. It is not community-based, and there is the huge gender equality issue that's there. Why are we, or should we be, supporting a process that more clearly and decisively brings people to criminal court for sexual violence and rape of women? Should we, or is it too premature? Is that something that should be happening in tandem with all this? Because that's the only way I can see these other things working. So maybe you've been thinking about it a lot longer, so you can just give me some of your insights. And Abid as well, please join in with your comments too. I'll use the rest of my time, so it'll be the chair that cuts you off.
Thank you so much. These are important issues, and if I had more than 8 minutes, I would love to have included them in the things I talk about. These are things that are on the mind of the Yazidi community. They're talked about a lot. Amal Clooney is working on the issue of justice. Iraq is summarily executing a lot of people they accuse of being with ISIS with these fast trials that Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have been criticizing. When they execute them, they never mention the crimes against the Yazidis. I think that might have happened once. So this is something that's very frustrating to the community. Suddenly they've got the terrorists, they're killing them, and yet there's no justice for us because they're not being tried for the genocide or for the sexual enslavement. However, all of this has nothing to do with the survival of Yazidis in the future in the country. So it's a very important issue. It's a very important moral issue. It'll help the spirit of the community. But to me, it is secondary in importance to the political problems and administrative vacuum that I talked about, because those are the issues that are inhibiting reconstruction and the return of families to their homes. So for me, that's preeminent. The other is secondary. So,
Yeah,
and I
well,
also think about the international community. We are the international community.
Yep.
And I don't think there's any problem with involving the UN in the kind of commission I mentioned. The problem is that the UN on its own just will not pursue a project to create this kind of political change. We, as financial supporters of Iraq and the Kurds, we who provide the weapons that they depend on for their armies, we have influence to affect this kind of change that the UN does not have.
Okay, thank you. Abid.
Yes, so I mean, yes, of course we want to involve the international community, and this is part of the our work, Nadia Murad's work with Amal Clooney for the past almost 3 years to get the UN Security Council to pass the resolution to investigate ISIS crimes. But the problem is the process is super slow. It does not move. As I mentioned, since September of last year, the resolution was passed, and we have been trying to push through the team to go and collect the evidence from these mass graves, and yet the team is not ready, it's not deployed, they're not on the ground to do the work. So the Iraqis decided to open the mass graves themselves without any international oversight. And so we contacted the Iraqi government through the U.S. government, and we made sure they stopped the process for now until further notice. So hopefully the international or the UN team can join them at least to observe the process. This is part of what we do, but what we are mentioning in terms of local governance and reconstruction, we just want to make sure that the community is part of the solution, is involved, so they can rebuild their own areas by themselves or be part of the process and not bring some. So for example, instead of taking those local officials that were controlling Sinjar prior to 2014 and during 2014 to a court and or basically asking them questions: why did you leave? Why did you not warn the Yazidi community that ISIS will attack you? They are now imposing the same officials to go back and run Sinjar again without any accountability. This is the problem. We Yazidis want to see ISIS criminals in court and in an international court, of course. This is what we preferred this whole time. And, you know, in fact, I wish and we want to see some sort of Nuremberg type of trials. You know, the Truth Commission in South Africa, something of similar, where ISIS members can confess to especially the sexual violence they committed against Yazidi women and children. And we want to see that. As Matthew mentioned, ISIS members who have been taken to court in Iraq are being charged on terrorism charges only. They have not mentioned, not in any case that I've seen, mentioned any of their involvement in the sexual enslavement of Yazidi women. And this is what we want to see. That's why we want the international community to be involved in this process.
I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here and for your very knowledgeable testimony. And we are going to suspend now for just 1 minute and clear the room so that we can go in camera for some committee business. Thank you.